leaked Russian documents obtained by Reuters have revealed the sorry state of the Russian armed forces. And we are going to be breaking that down in this video. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. It is October 27th, 2022. This is your daily Ukraine update, and we are going to be diving deep into just what is left of the Russian fighting capacity. Let's get into it. Okay, first off, as always, I will always update you guys on the tactical map here. And the only real change is some Russian retreats and Ukrainian advances in this area here. But we've discussed this, that this seems more like Russian repositioning along this wooded area to form a more defensible line. What I also want to point out is that as of, I think it's yesterday, Reuters investigations obtained leaked documents, particularly a notebook that really should have been destroyed with 91 pages of information. And they obtained it from a Russian headquarters in Balakia that was used as a Russian military command post, but was abandoned quickly in the Ukrainian attacks. And if you're not sure or don't remember, Balakia is right here near Izum. And as you can see, it was liberated around the early to mid part of September during the big Ukrainian counteroffensive. And there's so much wild information in here. We're going to break down just some of it. Okay, so first off, the Russian, all this data comes to us from early September, right? So this was before Ukraine's big counteroffensive. It appeared that the author just stopped writing in it, or switched to a new notebook sometime in the early September timeframe, right? So this is even before all the Russian equipment losses, all the personnel losses around the counteroffensive. First, it says that two of the it looks like what we would consider maybe a brigade. Two of the battalions of the brigade were operating at just 20% of their full strength. To give you guys a perspective on how bad that is, by U.S. NATO doctrine, a unit at 50% strength is considered no longer mission effective. They cannot perform the missions that you can assign a battalion to. And there's actually very specific guidelines that say, okay, if you're an infantry battalion, you should be able to perform a defense of this length of line of contact, right? Or they should be able to attack an enemy force of X size, or they can conduct a reconnaissance on an area of X square miles. They're very specific. And that's, of course, to ensure interoperability, so that if you have let's say you had a French brigade or a French battalion, you would know that they are able to do pretty much the same thing as a U.S. battalion, because they're specifically laid out doctrinal standards for what they can achieve. And when those units fall below 50% of their combat strength, we consider them combat ineffective. They're unable to perform any of their missions, not even in a degraded way. So the fact that these forces are still out there trying to punch up and trying to engage in combat at just 20% of their strength, literally they are a battalion who is functionally a company, and they're still being treated as independent units, is wild. What probably should happen is that they should be moved to the rear, reconsolidated into a single unit, along with other units that have taken significant casualties, and given a couple of weeks at least to build a new command structure, gain some equipment, and be assigned to a proper mission befitting a somewhat understrength battalion. But that's not even the worst of it, right? There is a sense that a lot of these leaders do not really care at all about their forces. It is considered routine for Russians to just sort of arbitrarily order their staff around. Here's one other interesting part that I thought was really fascinating. The let's see if we can find it here. This, here we go. The force in Balakia included a commandant whose only responsibility was keeping the local civilian population in check. And he oversaw an interrogation center where civilians were beaten and questioned using electrical shocks, according to 6 former detainees and Ukrainian officials. So again, this is, Russia would have you believe that some of these sort of war crimes are a function of like rogue soldiers or rogue elements. But in fact, the fact that you designated a single person as the civilian, population, the civilian catcher, tells us that that's not the case. When we scroll through, right, we can see sort of how this particular fighting force was organized. It's under the Baltic Fleet, and you have a deputy commander for military political work. You have a head of staff, a deputy rear commander, or deputy commander for the rear. So maybe that's their version of a supply and logistics. Deputy commander for weapons, head of artillery, head of intelligence, head of anti-aircraft, and a head of electronic warfare. These two sort of fascinate me because these are very specific areas. And the fact that anti-aircraft gets its own designated section as well as electronic warfare is a pretty interesting look. And I wonder if that's a standard Russian military formation, or if you have if this is a reflection of the Ukraine conflict. Also interesting, what I don't see, there's a head of artillery, but there's no armor or infantry, dismounted infantry troops, right? And maybe that's military political work, or maybe that's weapons. But I think of weapons, where does weapons end and logistics begin? Again, obtaining, repairing, getting munitions for weapons. I think of all those as if you told me you were a weapons major, that's what I would think. But again, if any of you guys in the comments have served in the Russian army or a Soviet army, let me know what those roles actually involve. Also fascinating that the Russians, you were using old Soviet maps of Ukraine. That's also wild that in 20 plus years, and again, the Russians have been fighting in Ukraine, right? They seized Crimea. They were fighting in the Donbas for 8 years, and they're still relying on Soviet maps, right? Look at how much must have changed in Ukraine that they can't even update their maps. That is wild. I mean, again, you hope that perhaps that maybe that Soviet maps are just the ones that they left, and that the more updated maps were taken out of the headquarters. Like, that's very possible. But again, just having an outdated map is a recipe to confuse people. If one person is using a map that features only some of the roads, or antiquated roads, or roads that have been closed, or villages that don't exist or have become smaller or larger, and someone else is using a more up-to-date map, then it's going to be a recipe for just total confusion on the battlefield. As we scroll through, there's also some specific stories of individuals who are detained in the police station under that civilian management officer and some of his soldiers. It actually profiles one was a firefighter and one is an inspector in the EMS services. And this actually makes a lot of sense. These represent sort of agents of the Ukrainian government in a literal way that are in your territory. Obviously, we don't think of firefighters or an EMS bureaucrat as being necessarily government representatives or government, part of government forces. But to Russia, they looked like that. It says that the Russian soldiers questioned the inspector repeatedly about his calls with his supervisor in Kharkiv. And this, again, makes a lot of sense that the government already has these networks in place, these vetted, trusted individuals, and they could be used for things like intelligence gathering. It's possible. Of course, the firefighter was accused of hiding weapons and organizing a partisan group, which he denies. And it seems perfectly logical that Russia is going to target these people. Of course, you can imagine if a foreign country shows up and starts arresting firefighters and EMTs, the community is going to be absolutely livid. For someone who's trying to save Ukraine from a corrupt government, this is probably not who you want to be going after. But again, Russia just seems to be running things the Soviet way. When we look about more information, they also say that the policing function in this society, in these occupied regions where most able-bodied men have been drafted, I think this was in actually the LNR, Luhansk, falls to just comically ragtag groups. It describes one corporal was 65 years old. This would be like a police corporal. Another was treated for finger wounds after the chamber of his Mosin exploded. Okay, to give you an idea of how terrible that is, the Mosin, yes, is a rifle developed in the 1880s, and most of the Mosins that you can buy here in the U.S., they stopped production of really right around the Second World War. My Mosin is from, for example, 44. So the idea that these guys are carrying pre-World War II rifles is insanely out of date, right? And of course, one LNR company commander said that of his 8 subordinates, 8 of his soldiers had previous conviction, including 2 for things that I can't even tell you about or I'll be demonetized. But rest assured, these are not exactly the finest of the finest fighting forces here. But when we look, there's even more wild stories. In one instance, see if we can find it here. A small, really, it said troops belonging to Russia's 9th Motorized Regiment were holed up in a concrete grain elevator in a town called Kharkov. And when we look at Kharkov, I think this looks like it was during a Ukrainian attack. Here we go, in Kharkiv. Yeah, it was right here. So right on what used to be the front lines. And these guys were in danger of getting overwhelmed. It was a squad-sized element, right? Literally so small was this troop contingent that the whole contingent presumably was sleeping on grain elevator conveyor belts. So we're talking about 10 soldiers, maybe. The one they called their position was being overrun. He had to retreat, and he requested artillery strikes to destroy the post he was abandoning. And then the commander of the Western Military District, this is like number, 3 under Putin, maybe 4, demanded a brief on the situation and ordered that those troops must not surrender, which is an insane level of micromanagement by military standards. If you feel that way, then, you should do something about it, which they did. When a commander that powerful demands that a town not fall, they find reinforcements and mobilize attack helicopters. And it did push the Ukrainians back. But Russians lost a tank, 2 armored personnel carriers, and other equipment, as well as 39 wounded, 7 dead, and 17 reported missing. Hopefully they just surrendered or took off their clothes and dipped into the Ukrainian population. It also says that 5 soldiers were reported as having, quote, an acute reaction to stress. I've seen that, and acute is probably the right word for it. Let's see if we can find it. There's also a breakdown of the remaining logistics. Of course, they are urgent. Russian forces at one point in this battle urgently request quadcopters. We've seen this. Russia just doesn't seem to have the UAV drone capacity. And when they did finally get 3 quadcopters, they realized that they never needed to install the software, and they needed to train soldiers on how to fly them. This was really trying to play catch up, given that Ukrainian forces have been using drones since basically the start of this conflict. And when we look even further, we see, right, one company commander ordered his men to walk right into artillery fire. Just wild, wild stuff. One commander was facing disciplinary action because he pulled his platoon back from a hopeless situation. These are just unbelievable, unbelievable insight. Here is another really interesting comment he made. Communications that Russian forces are intercepting from Ukrainians, some that helped them, that actually, even as early as late July, indicated that Ukrainian forces were preparing a counteroffensive to take control of Wallachia. Those intercepted cell phones were registered in countries like Estonia, Britain, the Netherlands, and the United States. Of course, Russian officers in the command bunker thought these phones were the possession of mercenaries or foreign instructors helping the Ukrainian military. I think what's much, much, much more likely is that in order to avoid Russia destroying or compromising Ukrainian phone numbers, these countries probably sent active cell phones, maybe even satellite cell phones with their phone numbers to, or even just SIM cards with those phone numbers to the Ukrainian forces. Also, if you were to say pay the Ukrainian forces cell phone bills, literally to ensure communications remain active, you would just send them paid up SIM cards from your country. That's just the more likely explanation, other than, hordes of foreign mercenaries whose phones won't really work in Ukraine. And foreign instructors almost certainly are not going to be anywhere near the front lines because of the political fallout of taking casualties, having your country take casualties. Let's see. There's one other part I want to talk about. So as of August 30th, the entire brigade said it was about 71% full strength. But the worst were in just the 20s. It said one battalion had just 49 personnel instead of its assigned 240. Another spreadsheet showed that as of July, by late July, there were 5 drones held by the brigade, but by the end of August, they were down to just 2. 8 armored personnel carriers dropped to 3. 4 anti-tank weapons, they were down to just 4 anti-tank weapon systems, down from 24 at the end of July. And they had this Zoopark system for suppressing enemy electronic systems, and it was out of commission by the end of August. It just shows that, again, we've talked about this. We've talked about this before, that the counteroffensive in Kharkiv was, yes, a result of tactical maneuvering, but it was also a result of lots and lots of operational pressure, pressuring Russian logistics, grinding down Russian equipment, and creating conditions for success. There's so many more interesting stories here, but I just want you guys to really give it a read. I'm going to link to it in the description, but hopefully you understand just how burned out the Russian military became prior to this offensive, and that this offensive was not a miracle or a tactical victory. This was 100% strategic thinking by Ukrainian forces, creating a Russian military that was on its last legs before the offensive ever started. Anyway, guys, thanks so much for joining me. Of course, if you want access to the uncensored combat video breakdowns, the stuff that's too intense for me to show you on YouTube, become a member of the Patreon. Link is in the description. Thanks to my lieutenant tier patrons. I'll see you all in the next one.